Hello and welcome to Business Today Television. I'm Siddharth Zarabi and you're watching Easynomics, our special coverage all through the month until the budget on what to expect from budget 2024-25, the first full budget of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's third term, Nirmala Sitharaman's seventh budget, and a budget where there are a lot of expectations being built in as to what kind of policy direction will it indicate, not just for the remaining months of the fiscal, but for the rest of the Modi 3.0 term. And joining me today on the subject are Madan Sabnavis, Chief Economist, Bank of Baroda. We have Sunil Sinha, Senior Director and Principal Economist at India Ratings and Research. We also have Suvodeep Rakshit, Chief Economist at Kotak Institutional Equities. Welcome to the show. Madan, I start with you. How's the overall macro backdrop to this budget, and what has changed from the interim budget numbers in the last 1 quarter of the current financial year that might have an impact on the major numbers in the budget?
No, I think, Siddharth, when the budget is being presented this time, I think the biggest advantage is that nothing really has changed since February, which means that as far as the Indian economy is concerned, we seem to be on a very stable growth path, and we are looking at a growth of 7.3, 7.4% for this year, which I think because of the base year of last year, it comes down. Otherwise, we're looking at stable growth across all the sectors. Of course, the caveat always being about the monsoon being an uncertainty. But otherwise, if we look at the other trends in the economy, they're fairly stable, and it's a continuation of what we have seen earlier, which really means that there is no need for the government to reassess its policies. You can continue on the same footing. Now, it all depends upon whether the government would like to press the accelerator in this particular budget in terms of spending more on capital expenditure, or would it wait for this year to go by and take a firmer assessment at the end of the year before doing something more aggressive in the coming year? Because I think everything is going according to plan right now. And if the monsoon plays out well and we don't have problems on the agricultural front, I think it would be a fairly enviable situation for any government when it comes to formulating budget and also the policies. It can be a continuity of whatever was being done in the past.
Sunil Sinha, the return of Prime Minister Modi, it's largely change, continuity, without any major change when it comes to ministerial portfolios. Do you suspect that the budgetary priorities will change, or will it be more of the same?
Well, I mean, as you rightly said, that the way the ministers were decided in the Modi 3.0 clearly signals continuity, and in my view, to a large extent, the same pattern will find a reflection even in the budget. So I don't see too many tinkering happening from the interim budget to the final budget, except perhaps that some bit of reflection of the fact that the employment and the consumption demand has not panned out the way it was expected. So somewhere, I mean, if you look at the GDP numbers, then the fiscal year 24 GDP growing at 8.2% and your private final consumption expenditure growing at 4%, I mean, less than half, certainly sends a signal that on the macro front, things appear pretty much in control, but somewhere some attention needs to be given as to what is required to actually stimulate the overall consumption demand. One way forward, of course, is the monsoon. So if monsoon pans out well, if agricultural production turns out to be as per expectation, then maybe some bit of rural demand will compensate for the overall consumption demand. But whether there is anything specific that this budget will do to boost the consumption demand, I have my doubts, because the focus continues to be on investment and will continue to be on the investment even in the full budget. The expectation is that this investment demand in times to come will get converted into consumption demand as and when the projects and other things, becomes operational or actually comes on stream.
Suvodeep, that same question to you. Should we expect continuity without any changes? Because there have been people who say continuity with change. But the question I'm asking you, will the government continue to focus on the broader priorities that it has adopted, especially post-COVID?
So Siddharth, the way to look at it and the way I look at it is that the underlying framework doesn't change. The supply side economics continues. What has changed from the interim budget till now is that the RBI has given a huge surplus, which was not accounted for. The question hence arises, what do you do with the extra money? And here I think that, I think it should be clear in understanding that there are three avenues that the government can use this money. One is for fiscal consolidation. Second, it can use on welfare schemes, and third is increase the capital expenditure, or a combination of all three, right? To that extent, I think the spending pattern will continue to mimic what they have done over the last 4-5 years, especially after the COVID. That focus on the supply side, focus on capital expenditure, focus on infrastructure. At the same time, you have to take into cognizance what has been happening post-COVID in the labor markets, in consumption. And to that extent, if you can extend certain spending into the welfare schemes, which again does not mean handouts being given to people in general, but focused in certain areas. And the areas could also be well identified in terms of the priorities. It could be something like rural housing, it could be something like rural roads, which does not necessarily become a handout, but continues in the same path of more capex, but at the same time focused on a certain part or certain geography. I think that is something that we should be focusing on when we are thinking of it, of the budget in terms of how it can change.
Madan, some of the headlines seem to suggest that there will be certain steps as far as increasing the spending on social sector schemes. Now we can count all of them. We also know the size of the social spend budget of the Government of India, but there are significant state elections coming up where the ruling party will have to respond to some of the concerns that we are seeing on inflation, on jobs. Do you expect the budget to play a role given those broader political socio-economic priorities?
No, not really, because I think we are talking of a union budget. And when we're talking of the state elections coming up, I'm quite sure there will be certain promises made by the respective parties in the states, depending upon where there is a lacuna. As far as
Maharashtra has already done that. Absolutely, you are right.
So what I believe is that when you're talking of social spending, I think there's been a lot of talk and a lot of discussion on whether the government should be spending more on education and health. I think these are the broader things. They're not really handouts. You're not giving cash to anyone. You're not giving subsidies to anyone. But I think that kind of social infrastructure is something which needs to be strengthened in the country, because we all know that when we're all talking in terms of jobs being created, the government cannot keep employing more people. The employment comes primarily in the private sector. So you give incentives to the private sector so that they're able to invest, they're able to employ more people, but that's going to be a very slow process. Simultaneously, you also need to make sure that you have a skilled labor force. So that is why I think the government needs to spend more on education and also on health, because when you're talking of children, I think it's necessary that they should not be stunted. They should be of minimum size, minimum health standards should be maintained for them. So I think that is something which the government will definitely work on. Admittedly, these are concurrent subjects. You also have the states which need to invest in it. But I think that will be a good step for the government to take, because you try and make sure that the people are better qualified, not just in terms of having better degrees, but also in terms of certain skill sets, to vocational skills which you're talking of, which directly lead to jobs. Maybe not at a high level. We're not talking in terms of the IT sector or the engineering sector. It's going to be more at maybe your plumbing, your carpenters, people who go into construction, which requires certain kind of skill sets. So I think that is where there would be concentration on, because that will help to create jobs in the medium term.
Sunil, is the peak for budgetary allocations for capital expenditure and infrastructure behind us now?
Look, so far as capital expenditure is concerned, I guess the focus of this government has been on capital expenditure, and it will continue to be on capital expenditure. However, one of the things which perhaps this government can do is that in last two budgets, we have seen that a certain amount of capital expenditure has been set aside, and that money has been extended to the state government as long-term loan, 50-year interest-free loan, which is what has helped states to actually step up their capital expenditure. Now, in this year's interim budget, the amount that was allocated last year has not undergone any change. But now that the RBI has given a much higher dividend, which has increased the elbow room available for the government, I mean, in terms of where to spend. And in my view, capital expenditure, whether it is done by the union government or it is done by the state government, I mean, at one level, it is a capital expenditure. But the fact remains that the gestation period of most of the capital expenditure done by the union government are relatively longer as compared to the ones which are undertaken by the state government. So if the idea is to have a quick impact of this capital expenditure on the economy, either in terms of employment or in terms of income, then maybe if the government increases the capital expenditure allocated for the state government to take as long-term loan, and then state governments in turn spends it, probably the multiplier effect on the economy will be much bigger. And I think, in my view, that perhaps is the need of the hour, because jobs have become an important issue which no government is willing to ignore.
Madan, one of the other things that we are going into the budget preparation exercise that is underway at North Block is tax collections. Tax collections have been doing very well, and in fact on the indirect tax front they have been doing so well that there is discomfort that we learn from various sources within the government that has led to the discontinuation of the monthly GST release data, something that had been going on for 7 years. That data release has been stopped because it might lead to more criticism that on one hand governments, state and center are collecting so much indirect tax revenue, whereas inflation continues to bite the common man. The question I have for you is, in terms of the overall tax policy approach, is there any likelihood of any relief that certain sections have been demanding, especially the middle class? Can we expect that?
No, in fact, I think there will definitely be concessions given on the income tax front. The FM had stated during the interim budget side that she was not making any concessions, not making any announcement on tax front, because it was an interim budget. As a matter of prudence, they decided not to do it. Now, today, when we're talking in terms of the fact that consumption has not been growing, the only way you can spur this is by increasing the purchasing power of the individuals. Now, we know that inflation is high, but even if inflation comes on from 5 to 4%, we should remember that prices are increasing, and budgets are affected not by today's inflation, but by cumulative inflation. So if you look over the last 3-4 years, cumulative inflation has been around 25%. So just think of this situation: my income is 100, inflation has actually been 25% over the last few years. My income hasn't increased at the same extent. So there's definitely a case of me cutting back on my consumption. So that is something which has taken place. So one way the government can alleviate it is to actually have an intervention and try and make sure that you give certain tax reliefs, because these tax brackets which have been there have not been changed for a number of years. While there is a new tax system which tells you to do away with concessions, I think a good idea for the government to do is to say that if you are a saver, stick to the old system and I increase the level of ATC, the housing loan, so that 1.5 becomes 3 lakhs, 2 lakhs becomes 4 lakhs, because if we just index all these levels with inflation, I think there is need for you to increase it. In case you're a consumer, go in for the new tax system and you just increase those slabs. And I think a sensible thing for the government to do is all these tax slabs or these income slabs which we have should be indexed to inflation, so that as inflation numbers come out, and just like how capital gains allows us to index it with the cost of living index, you bring the same index and says that if 3 lakhs is my exemption level, tomorrow inflation is 5%, automatically it becomes 3,15,000 in the next year, and so on and so forth. I think that will be a prudent thing to do, and that's one way in which you'll be able to protect the real purchasing power of individuals.
And Madan, then the income tax department may become the biggest votary for inflation control rather than just the RBI. But that's a very good point. Sunil, what do you think are the sectors, singular or plural, your choice, that need the maximum amount of budgetary intervention in the forthcoming speech?
Well, I think it's not a brainer. I think education and health are the two most crucial and important, areas where government expenditure has not been keeping pace with what is required in the economy. I mean, say, for example, 3% of GDP spending on education, 6% on health. All of these has been well documented, articulated over a long period of time. But over the years, we have seen that these sectors have not received that kind of an allocation. So suddenly we are, inching closer to those, benchmarks. But I guess, spending on health, education, apart from infrastructure, will build the overall productive capacity in the economy, which can then become the basis or the base for accelerating the growth. Without that, I mean, both the physical infrastructure as well as the social or human capital are important to really not only maintain the current level of growth momentum, but also to accelerate it, so that in times to come, I mean, whatever cherished goal we have in terms of reaching certain level of, overall output, we can achieve that, and also reduce the overall, income inequality, as well as pull the people out of poverty. I mean, say, for example, we are currently in the lower middle income bracket. Now, if we have to really move out of this lower income bracket and reach the upper middle income bracket, then it's a long journey. And health and education, along with the physical infrastructure, will be absolutely critical to reach there.
Suvodeep, I want to ask you a sort of a tangential question, but this arises from the run-up that we have been seeing in our stock markets around the consumption theme. The assumption that is being made by a lot of players, and real money is being put on a bet which we don't know whether it will play out true, is that the government will switch in some ways towards consumption and diversify a bit away from the capex heavy scheme of things that we have seen in the past few years. Do you think the budgetary circumstances, the overall nature of the balance sheet, the RBI bonanza and everything else together actually supports this assumption? And I repeat, it's an assumption at this stage that the markets seem to be making, Suvodeep?
Yes, I mean, look, if you're looking at it as an assumption, yes, there could be some push towards, let's say, agriculture or rural, education, health, which is not necessarily what we have been seeing in terms of the focus areas, which is defense, roads, railways, in terms of the capex. This does not mean that there is a huge amount of allocation change that might happen. And this is, I think, crucial, because when we talk about the markets, etc., when assumptions are made, I think the assumptions often could become unhinged. And to that extent, I think the assumption should be in line with what is possible. Because if you look at the possibility of how an additional room given by the RBI can be used, of course, there will have to be an increase in the capex, because if you look at the capex and you go back to the roads and railways allocation and the growth in the interim budget, They were just 3 to 4% growth that was budgeted in the interim budget for roads and railways. So naturally, you have to increase, and if you have the headroom, you have to increase the allocation towards roads, railways, which has been your mainstay in terms of capex. The second part is in terms of the capex loans for capex given to the states. Now, it is important because some of the loans that are given to the states could be tied to certain conditions, right? And conditions which can again be geared towards, let's say, health or education reforms. And the reason why you can start linking it is because ultimately when we talk about education, health, and we have been talking about it for multiple years now, but it's a state subject and a center subject with a lot of the on the ground changes that one may want to see coming from the state governments. So you have to push the states towards that front, and to that extent, do you want to allocate a higher amount through the
Okay, I think we seem to have Suvodeep's internet bandwidth a little down. Let me come to you, Madan, and this is to ask you some of the big numbers.
Capex, right? Or whichever way you want to look at it.
Yeah, Madan, Suvodeep, we had lost you briefly there. Complete your point and then I'll go across to Madan. We lost you in the last 30 seconds.
Sorry. The point is that, if you're looking at the welfare side of things, and you go back to agri or go back to rural or education, health, the allocations here cannot increase by a significant amount, which may justify a huge kind of a allocation in the markets changing towards, let's say, consumption oriented stock. Consumption as a theme can evolve over time in the sense that some of the sectors which have not been doing well,
right.
For example, let's say the bottom of the pyramid may see some gradual cyclical recovery as incomes and savings, etc., improve. But it's not as if the government is going to shift away completely from what the framework it has set out over the past few years.
Absolutely. Madan, the broader point that I want you to explain to our viewers, and we were having this discussion earlier in our newsroom, is the way capital expenditure benefits the economy in the medium to long term versus revenue expenditure, of which the size continues to increase both at the state and the center level through all the schemes. Given the nature of the capital expenditure bets that the government, central government is taking, what do you think is the imperative right now from a growth perspective? Because growth is slowing down on account of various factors. What is the choice that you think the government should be making?
No, actually, they need to have a balance between revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. I'll give you the reason why. See, you require this revenue expenditure, the so-called social welfare schemes like a PM Kisan, Riga, subsidies, because that is where you're transferring money directly in the hands of people who are able to increase the consumption. Because that has been one problem which has been in the economy, that consumption is not increasing at a desired rate. On the other hand, when you're talking in terms of capital expenditure, what we're really doing is the government is concentrating just on two sectors. Now, we should remember that there are limits to which you can keep spending because there's an absorptive capacity, the implementation capacity of the government. So it's one thing to say I'm spending 11 lakh crores on capex. Can I increase it to 20 lakh crores? The answer is definitely not in 1 year. So it is something which will go up only gradually. And we should be a bit moderate when we're talking of our expectations of how much this capital expenditure can increase. And again, here I'd like to point to what the FMN mentioned in his speech last time, that I don't expect us to increase it by 20-30% every year. It happened in the last couple of years, it's not going to happen continuously. Now, how does capital expenditure work? When I construct more roads, there's obviously demand for cement, there's demand for steel, there's demand for machinery. So when these contracts are put out, there are companies which apply for it and get these particular contracts. And that means that you're actually creating a backward linkages with certain industries. And these industries in turn would then probably employ more people in order to carry out these projects. And if it's continuous, then there is going to be a continuous stream of employment also taking place. So it is something which works indirectly, but it creates an asset, it also creates employment, it creates the income, and accordingly it will create consumption. It's slightly slower in terms of the time taken for this entire cycle to go through, as compared to something like a PM Kisan, where I'm giving 6,000 or 5,000 rupees to every farmer in a particular month. The 5,000 rupees is going to be spent, and therefore I can assume that the 60,000 crores which is being spent on PM Kisan goes directly to spending, probably more likely for food items and maybe for some of the consumer durable items. If I go by the survey which NSSO carried out, people are spending also more on non-food items. So I think that's how it works. So a balance between the two, to my mind, is the right way to go about it, because I need investment, but I also need consumption to increase. Because this trickle-down theory of saying that industry grows and they create more jobs, more income, more consumption hasn't quite worked out. We need some direct approach also.
Absolutely, and if you look at corporate profitability, that point that you make, Madan, is borne out by the kind of corporate profitability increases that we have seen, and perhaps that is not being met by proportional increases in expenditure and private sector investment, and that's a point that the government will have to ponder over. As I wind down the show, what I want to do with all three of you here is to get you to speak about some of the big numbers that every union budget is known for and tracked very closely for the fiscal deficit number, the borrowing number and other numbers. Madan, I'll start with you again on that very quickly. 30 seconds. What are the top 3 or 4 numbers that you expect that you can share with our viewers?
No, I think I think the fiscal deficit number will moderate slightly from 5.1 to 5%, but this will not be because of the RBI money. I think it will be more because of the fact that we are expecting a higher GDP growth number. 10.5% in nominal terms was taken. That's number one. Number two, capital expenditure, I don't expect any change. It will remain at where it is. And the social welfare schemes, depending upon what was promised at the time of the budget, at the time of the elections, certain numbers would, of course, be tinkered with, but will not change things significantly. So more or less status quo on other numbers in terms of expenditures.
Sunil, that very same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, we expect the overall fiscal deficit to come down to 4.9% of GDP as compared to 5.1%, which was budgeted in the interim budget. And again, largely due to both, that we expect the nominal GDP growth to be higher than what it was assumed in the interim budget, and some bit of spillover effect of the higher dividend would also increase the elbow room of the finance minister to actually look at the fiscal deficit, and she can certainly use it to reduce it to say 4.9% of GDP. But broadly, in terms of overall size of the budget, in terms of expenditure, I don't think there is going to be much of a change. There may be some increase in the overall capital expenditure, but at the same time, I believe that in terms of sectoral allocation, largely it will follow whatever was presented during the interim. Not much change.
Okay, Suvodeep, what are the numbers that you are working with?
So fiscal deficit to GDP I have is at around 5%. That is what I am working with. And allocation to capital expenditure increases. If you compare it with the FY24 numbers, it should be around 25% growth. On the revenue expenditure, I am factoring in some increase in terms of rural and agri exposure, and that takes the revenue expenditure up to 6%. And if you look at the, broadly the receipt side, except for the non-tax receipt, I don't think anything else changes until and unless there is actually on the income tax side, if you look at the growth rate after the FY24 final numbers were released, or the provisional numbers were released, it's around 11% growth. That is much, much lower than what the trend that we have seen over the past few years, and hence that number should be higher, and to that extent, the receipts might be slightly on the higher side.
Okay, viewers, there you have it from three of India's top economists, what to expect as far as the macro and growth story is concerned from the budget. This is a budget, the 7th time that Nirmala Sitharaman will stand up and make a speech. She has more elbow room courtesy the Reserve Bank of India. The weather gods, the monsoon has come true. It's in fact running a week ahead of expectations, and therefore at least the volume so far, and hopefully we will not have sudden bursts that will upset things. So the monsoon is also pretty good. The government is back. It has a coalition majority. Parliament is going to be far more interesting in the monsoon session, as and when it is announced. The expectation right now of possibly the 22nd or the 23rd of July, and the economic survey followed by the budget will be the template that we will be very keenly watching for in terms of Modinomics and its priorities for this year and beyond as well. Madan, Sunil and Suvodeep, thank you very much for your time with us, and you the viewer for tuning in. We'll be back with more. Do stay tuned in to Business Today Television. I'll see you again. Bye-bye.
I start by thanking the returning officer and all the team who've been working here at the count and at the polling stations today. You make our democracy possible. I'd also